Do you welcome the news today? The Treasurer has confirmed that gross debt is going to be now $150 billion lower this year than previously expected. That's part of that repair effort, I guess you're talking about.
Well, I would hope that it could be even lower if the decisions to spend hadn't continued on. And there is an insatiable appetite to spend coming out of this government. And you don't need to look very far to see it. Just look at some of the Future Made in Australia announcements that seem to have no basis in purpose and certainly some rather hazy decision-making processes about it. $1 billion on solar panels that potentially will never be competitive. $500 million of Commonwealth taxpayer money and another $500 million from Queensland on a quantum computing company that is owned by Americans. All of these things seem to be very strange decisions that are being made by this government that is simply pushing expenditure further and further up. And it's Australians that are paying the price because unless you can get that expenditure under control, that appetite to spend under control, the RBA will keep having to work at getting inflation down.
That quantum decision, though, let's just zero in on that because I guess it's emblematic of the government's Future Made in Australia policy. They are talking about, this is about building a quantum computer, first of its kind, of this particular kind in Queensland. And Boston Consulting said that it would have a massive multiple flow-on effect for the economy if that is to be achieved. So isn't it smart of the government to try and leverage some of that technology and get there at the ground floor, so to speak?
You don't need to convince me of the benefits of quantum computing. I used to be the digital economy minister, and I know that quantum is a really important part of our AUKUS agreements, but it's also one of the great drivers, potentially, of productivity. It's this particular decision, though, that we have concerns with. There are plenty of quantum computing organisations out there, and even the chief scientist casts some doubt as to whether this particular investment is going to turbocharge the adoption of quantum in a commercially viable way.
We've seen some numbers out today. Retail trade volumes down 0.4% in March, in the March quarter, lower than had been expected. Is this showing that the retail, or not just retail, but consumers are hurting badly from the rate rises? Do you think that will help the RBA keep things where they are as opposed to hiking them?
There is no doubt that average Australians are really hurting right now, and that's reflected in those retail trade figures. And it shows that the economy really is slowing. The problem is it's aggregate demand that pushes up inflation. Aggregate demand is driven by two components. There's private sector, but there's also public sector. Our concern is that the public sector side of the equation hasn't come back in the same way that the private sector consumption has.
Are the states to blame for that largely?
Well, that's why
if you look at what's happening at the state level of Victoria today with payments for school-age kids, and Queensland, that $1,000 boost to energy bills for households, regardless of if that's not means tested.
Well, I don't think that it's only the states. Certainly the OECD have pointed out that state debt is genuinely a problem and states' fiscal positions are driving some of the problems with inflation, but it is not the only driver. And quite frankly, the Commonwealth government, particularly when you've got wall-to-wall Labor governments in mainland Australia, should be leading the charge in this crusade to get inflation down. Because unless you get inflation down, that Australians are going to pay the price. The cost of living simply will not come down until inflation is under control. And we're just not through the woods yet.
No, we're certainly not. And just with this interest rate decision today, some economists, like we spoke to Warren Hogan earlier in the program, suggesting that it might be smarter for the RBA if it is sticky, inflation proves to remain sticky, to act sooner rather than later, possibly as soon as today. Is there an argument there?
Well, I'm not going to preempt the RBA's decision. The RBA is an independent decision maker on interest rates, and that should always be the case. And I wouldn't want to jawbone the RBA governor in any way, shape or form. What I would say, though, is that the RBA's decision is made that much harder if it's the only one that's tackling inflation. Unless the government's using its fiscal firepower as well as using monetary policy to tackle inflation, well then inflation stays higher for longer and interest rates stay higher for longer. When interest rates stay higher for longer, Australians will pay the price. That's why one of the reasons we've seen real disposable incomes in Australia go backwards 7.5% in the last 2 years because of taxes, inflation and interest rates are making people poorer. If you feel poorer, it's because you are poorer, and that's because of inflation, because of taxes and interest rates.
Shadow Finance Minister Jane Hume, appreciate your time.
Great to be with you, Kieran.